Hello and a warm welcome to today's GGKP webinar, Stockholm Plus 50, Turning Commitments into Action in a New Digital Financial and Policy Landscape. I'm John Mon, coordinator of the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership, or GGKP, as it's better known, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. It's been 5 decades since world leaders gathered in Stockholm for the UN Conference on the Human Environment. That year in 1972 marked the birth of the modern environmental movement. This year's Stockholm Plus 50 meeting serves as a moment to reflect on the last 50 years, to remember the actions that we've taken and remind us of those that we still need to take in order to bring back a healthy planet and to make a brighter future for all. This webinar is the third in a 4-part series on the road to Stockholm Plus 50 between today and the end of May. The main Stockholm Plus 50 event will take place on the 2nd and 3rd of June. Stockholm Plus 50 is going to follow months of deliberations, which we're in the middle of right as we speak. Deliberations taking place around the world, including national and regional consultations from Africa and Europe to Asia and the Americas. Global engagement, including through the webinar series that you are now a part of, will be crucial to the success of the meeting. Today, we'll explore the theme of the third Stockholm Plus 50 Leadership Dialogue, accelerating the implementation of the environmental dimension of sustainable development in the context of the UN Decade of Action. The Decade of Action. Before we get started, I'd like to take just a brief moment to draw your attention to a few ways in which you can participate today. If you aren't familiar already, I encourage you to visit the dedicated Stockholm Plus 50 website, stockholm50.global, which includes a list of ways in which you can participate through events, key documents, news stories, and more. In particular, I'd like to direct you also to the Green Forum. This is an online community space for sharing insights on a range of themes related to a green economic transformation, including the one we're pursuing between now and June for Stockholm Plus 50. On that website, in the Green Forum rather, you'll find the Stockholm Plus 50 dedicated community space to engage in open discussion and discover new resources to learn from. You can register now at thegreenforum.org. Please do submit questions and comments throughout today's discussion through the Q&A function. It's a great way for you to engage directly with today's panelists. And after the webinar, we'd really appreciate it if you took just a few minutes to complete our short survey. Your feedback helps us shape our future webinars. Also note that a full recording of this session will be available very soon, within 24 hours of today's session, online on our website at ggkp.org/S50-commitment to action. I hope you'll also be able to join us for the final webinar in our series. This is the third. We've got 4, one coming at the end of May. The details for that webinar are coming out very soon. And if you'd like to stay in the loop, do go to ggkp.org/subscribe to sign up to our newsletter, and you'll be sure to be kept in the loop. So with that, it's now my great pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's event, Nosy Shabalala. She is CEO of the Conservation Strategists in South Africa, and she's been with us throughout the entire Stockholm Plus 50 webinar series, which has been a great pleasure. Without further ado, Nosy, I'm delighted to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, John. As always, a very gracious introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an absolute privilege to serve you again today as the moderator of this very important webinar series. Now, as you can see on your screen, the theme for today is all about how might we turn commitment into action in a new digital financial and policy landscape. And what this means is that we're going to really be zooming in on the role of finance, the role of digital technologies, and the role of academia in really addressing some of the barriers to full and meaningful participation of women, of youth, of indigenous communities and frontline communities, but we're also going to be tapping into the gender experts and aspects of this conversation. And I'm really pleased that when we get to our panel, we do have a gender expert who's going to be leaning into the conversation and really speaking to us around how can we ensure that those actions that we're wanting to see coming from those commitments, coming from those words, that they are gender responsive, and what role technology, finance, and academia can play in terms of delivering the necessary tools and services to support these transitions. As always, your voice is exceptionally important in this conversation. And once again, I want to reinforce John's words by extending the invitation to you to use the question function. Send us through your questions. Of course, you can also participate through comments that I will try to the best of my ability to integrate into the conversation so that you can claim your share of voice in this conversation. I'm going to be putting these to our panelists throughout the conversation. As in previous GGKP webinar series, we are going to start off with a scene setter. I'm going to be introducing our scene setter speaker shortly. From there, we're then going to transition into a very robust panel discussion, again, where your voice is going to be integrated. For those who are following us on social media or who are listening in and amplifying some of the sound bites and the insights coming out of this conversation onto the social media space, we are using the hashtag GGKP webinar, as well as hashtag Stockholm 50, as you can see on your screen. I think it's quite important for us to let the world know what this conversation is all about as we all journey towards that global moment of reflection at the Stockholm Plus 50 meeting in June. Without further ado, allow me then to establish the stage and to hand it over for our scene setter. We're joined by Mr. Asad Naqvi. He is the head of the Secretariat for PAGE, which of course is the Partnership for Action on Green Economy, as well as the head of the Secretariat for GGKP, of course, that being the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership, and here to talk to us and set the scene for today's conversation. Asad, it's over to you.
Well, thank you, Nosy. It's always a pleasure joining you in the conversations. You bring so much energy and passion to it. So, and all the panelists. So first of all, a warm welcome on behalf of PAGE and GGKP to all the participants, but all the speakers and panelists, and Nosy to you. I will just stay very brief. I think there are 4 messages that I will probably communicate, which will then resonate with where we stand on Stockholm Plus 50. The first message that is coming for the Stockholm is that nature, ecosystems, ecosystem services, and ecology are the irreplaceable foundations of our economy, of human prosperity, and the existence of life on Earth. We need to take care of them. And that's where you will see that in Stockholm Plus 50, there is the first leadership dialogue, which is focused on reflecting on the urgent need for action to achieve a healthy planet and prosperity for all. The second message that I think is coming out very clearly is that policy, investment, and business decisions that will be taken now to revive, to stimulate, and accelerate economies will determine if future risks to human prosperity are mitigated or amplified. We have a choice. The policymakers, the world has a choice because there are about $18 trillion on the table for economic recovery from COVID-19. They can accelerate the economy in no time, but create a disaster for the future, or they can be used to fix the economy and to align it with SDGs 2030 agenda and 1.5 degree targets. Through PAGE, we have done a bit of work on tracking the expenditure, and it seems that the world is not on track. And Stockholm Plus 50 is an opportunity to bring the world back on track for a long-term prosperity for human generations to come on this planet. So the second leadership dialogue is focused on achieving a sustainable and inclusive recovery from COVID-19 pandemic. And then is the third part, which is that financing is very, very important, both public and private sector finance. But the financing alone will not fill the policy and the capacity gaps that exist. There is a need for having strong institutions and strong capacity to complement the financial flows that are needed to fix and repair the planet. And that's where you will see that there is a need for concrete actions and recommendations that can come out from Stockholm Plus 50. And that's where the third leadership dialogue of the Stockholm Plus 50 is focusing on, which is accelerating the implementation of the environmental dimensions of sustainable development in the context of the decade of action. I think there is a fourth part to it, which brings the three sides or three dimensions together, which is that the siloed approach to environmental conservation or siloed approach to economic development has failed to deliver the future we want. There is a need for a coherent set of policy and national development planning, which provides an opportunity for addressing the economic and environmental challenges together. And that's where I say that we need partnerships. We need very broad partnerships, which help to tackle the economic and environmental and social development issues together. And for that, we need the knowledge base, and we need to look at what are the best practices. And that's where I would say GGKP is very unique in terms of its depository of knowledge that is available to policymakers to take informed decision making. We are having these dialogues. We are grateful that we are having this informal discussion, but in addition to this, there is a whole series of informal dialogues, informal working groups, which are more of the UN process-oriented consultations, which are happening on Stockholm Plus 50. Just a while ago today, we had the second informal working group for the Leadership Dialogue 3, and there is a series that will still come. But all the ideas that you are providing that will help to co-create an outcome document for the Stockholm Plus 50, which will create a pathway for where the world needs to go if it is to meet the targets of 2030 agenda, as well as the 1.5 degrees for the climate change. So this is sort of the context in which we are hosting this webinar today, and we look forward to your very concrete and sharp ideas for accelerating action. We had enough discussions. Now is the time for action that we need to take in terms of going forward and make this world a better place for us and our coming generations. So thank you so much, Nosy, for the opportunity to set the discussion. I hand it back over to you. Thank you.
Asad, thank you very much. And I think more than setting the context, you've also given us the intentionality behind these webinar series and where the voices and the contributions and the engagements are feeding into for what particular outcome. And so it's been a very useful way of scene setting, especially as we look to move beyond words, beyond conversations, and really get our sleeves rolled up with action in the right direction. Thank you very much. That's Asad Naqvi, ladies and gentlemen. I do want to acknowledge Nicholas, and I think it's already Nicholas King as well as Jim Dugan already first off the blocks with some really great questions and some really great comments. And of course, Jim, your question is very important, and I'm sure that as Asad was speaking, you were leaning into that conversation because you are asking about the extent to which the outcomes of Stockholm Plus 50 will be able to bind us and hold us accountable. And these are the kind of inputs that we're looking for. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure now to introduce our panelists. Again, to remind you that your voice is going to be exceptionally important in this conversation. As I introduce them, they're going to put their cameras on so you can see all of them on your screen. And I want to make sure that I can see everyone on my screen. And I'm seeing David right now. And I'm going to invite everybody else, if they haven't, to put their cameras on. So I'm going to start off with David because he was first off the mark. David Jensen, he is the coordinator of the Digital Transformation Sub-Program at UNEP, the UN Environment Program. And he's responsible for accelerating UNEP's work on climate stability, on nature protection and pollution prevention, most importantly for this conversation, using data and digital technologies. So we're really relying on David's lens and experience and insight to give us that digital lens and the role of digital technologies in accelerating action. So David, thank you very much for being here with us. Luca De Lorenzo, welcome to you, Luca. Luca is a senior director at the Nordic Investment Bank, or NIB. And before that, he actually also headed up the Climate, Energy and Society unit at the Stockholm Environment Institution, or SEI, where he was researching how to transform energy politics, economics, and business into sustainable models. No doubt, Luca, we're going to be tapping into some of that prior experience. But I think it's important to also note that at that time, Luca also co-founded the Stockholm Sustainable Finance Center, which really looks at accelerating the shift in capital investments to deliver on the sustainable development goals and the climate targets. And so all of that really coming into sharp focus. And we want to maybe tap Luca for some of the real work that's happening in the finance space, and not so much the theoretical concepts, but the practical things that we can latch onto. Emanuela Pozen is on my screen. Emanuela, it's lovely to see you. Emanuela is a senior gender equality and non-discrimination specialist at the International Labour Organization, or the ILO. And she is coming into this conversation with over 20 years of experience working in multiple geographies, including the Middle East, Africa, as well as Asia, on gender equality and non-discrimination in the world of work. And so really going to be important for us to tap into her insights on how do we make sure that all actions are gender responsive, gender sensitive, and that we ensure that they work not only for parts of the population, but they work comprehensively, not leaving women behind. I also want to bring to your attention that I know we have a young person here, Antidius, if you're with us, maybe to invite you to put your camera on. There you are. Antidius Raphael, you might remember him from our previous webinars that we had as a part of the series. So to welcome back to you, Antidius. Antidius is an eco-hydrologist. He's a nature-based solutions ecosystems restoration expert. He's also a member of the World Youth Parliament for Water. He really comes into this conversation carrying the mandate of a young leader, the mandate of a youthful voice, and of course a young person who is part of the youth Stockholm Plus 50 task force, and he is from Tanzania. And so welcome to you, Antidius. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we are working on a voice from academia. We are expecting Professor Salimul Haq, and if he does join us, I will then introduce him accordingly, but he's currently just experiencing some technical challenges, but certainly looking forward to having him in the conversation. So maybe let me start off. You will notice, Antidius, if you look into the questions, that the question from Nicholas is one that you're going to be very interested in. And so I'm hoping that we're going to get an opportunity for you to respond to the question that Nicholas has put on the chat for us. But Luca, let me kick it off with you. We talk a lot about sustainable finance. How do you define sustainable finance as one part of the question? But also, more importantly, how are the social elements of sustainability factored in to the way that we define sustainable finance?
Thank you, Nosy, and a pleasure to be here. And good afternoon to everyone from my side as well. Yeah, definition of sustainable finance. I mean, you have many possible definitions out there, but I would say at the highest level, it's a little bit like you have introduced it before. Ultimately, it's about looking at what capital allocation we are moving, shifting in support of the Sustainable Development Goals. You know, in a nutshell, that's what we look at, also from a bank perspective that I represent. Then how you actually do that in the details, you know, usually goes down to which thresholds, which criteria do you have, what framework do you use. Back in the days, it used to be that everybody had their own. We still have that to some extent, but more and more, I would say, in the financial sector, which is a positive evolution. You're seeing kind of global references. EU taxonomy is helping, green bond principles, you know, defining some sort of at least common language, common set of criteria. And that is super helpful in the financial sector because it helps to start standardizing. It's a strong word. We're not there yet, but, you know, it helps to create these blocks where then financiers can more easily and understandably allocate the capital accordingly.
Look, I want to maybe just pause there because I want to come with a little bit of a follow-up. So it's really interesting to hear you talk about a move away from a siloed approach, a move towards a common language, a move towards standardization. What has been the net impact of that? Can you point us to any examples of innovative sustainability projects that you have financed that really has come out of this growing and shared understanding of sustainable finance?
Yeah, I mean, we, as I said, we are a bank. Just to get a sense, we provide long-term lending. We do about 3 to 4 billion a year of lending. We have a balance sheet of 40 billion, and as you say, we have a few projects. We have a long history of sustainable finance, but lately, using these frameworks, I think I could say pretty safely that the dark green sectors, those are now fully understood in the financial sector. So, for example, lately we have financed a battery gigafactory here in the Nordics. So that's a bit innovative from a banking perspective. That's a new technology, but that's clearly dark green in the direction, right? We are also looking at electrifying ferries. Shipping is a hard to abate sector, as they say. So those are also things that more and more are coming online on stream as projects, and they are clearly financeable, right? And that is on top of course, I'm not even touching the renewable energy space, because that's, to me, is kind of obvious, right? Just to give you a sense. But before, Nozi, you also asked about what are the social elements in all of this, right? And just to pick quickly on that, just a few seconds on that. I think looking at social elements, there are two ways. One, in everything we finance, whether it's for climate, environment, ecosystems, we need to take into account the social angle of it, right? So even if the social angle is not the prime purpose of why we are financing something, not the prime impact, we still always have to take that into account. And you see this thinking, for example, in the EU taxonomy, you have the social minimum safeguards type of approach. And we do that as a bank. But of course, that's one element of sustainable finance. The other one is that you can actually look at social impact as the core and prime element of what you're financing. We do some of that as a bank. We still do things like school, hospitals, so it's more healthcare and human capital. But of course, that could also be a way to define social in support in financing.
Yeah, so, and that's really interesting, and I'm going to hopefully unpack a little bit later, how that particular conversation in the context of collaboration, in the context of partnerships is playing out. But a quick question from Ate right now, the role of blockchain technology in green transformation. Quick thoughts from you on that, Luca?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think we're going to see, we're going to have to see how it develops. My interaction with blockchain has been, I'll tell you where it can unlock a few things. Sometimes in finance, there has been, I wouldn't say a bottleneck, but there is a little bit something around linking impact to the actual money that is going, and to the money flows, right? And that we do now with impact reporting and all of this. It has been manual. It's being standardized. David, maybe you can speak to that as well. There is a lot of digitalization and data involved in this as well. But that's where blockchain actually could unlock something in the financial world, because with blockchain, you can tag more directly impact, right? Whether it's social, whatever metric it is, whether it can, to the actual transaction, and you can follow it through the ownership, through the financiers, and through the financial markets. That's an interesting area to, we're keeping an eye on it. We're not using it yet, but that would be my response to that question.
Luca, thank you very much. Ete, I hope that was a good response, but I saw David nodding, so I will bring it to David as well to just hear some of his thoughts. But David, before we talk blockchain and the opportunities behind blockchain, what is the link between environment and digitalization? Can you just simplify how these two come together?
Sure, I'd be happy to, and thanks again for inviting me to this conversation. I think the link works in two directions. I think on the one hand, sort of the digital transformation of the world, which is currently ongoing, is perhaps one of the single biggest opportunities to achieve planetary sustainability in human civilization in our history. I think, and I say that because digital transformation is fundamentally changing all the systems around us, right? Each economic sector and every single system we rely on is being transformed by digital tech. And if we can inject environmental sustainability into that transformation process, we could potentially achieve the kind of planetary scale sustainability we have failed to achieve so far. So on the one hand, huge opportunity if we can embed environmental sustainability outcomes into the digitalization process. But I think there is a downside there is a dark side that we also have to think about. Digitalization itself has an environmental impact, right? Requires materials, generates e-waste, requires energy. There are a whole series of negative outcomes, including even accelerating consumption, right? Something we don't want to achieve, which is actually hyper-consumption. Digital technologies are also contributing to that. So I think there is a massive opportunity space. There is as well a big risk space, and we need to navigate the two. And that's why, as Asad said, partnerships are going to be key, right? Governments alone are not going to be able to navigate, the benefits and the risks. It's got to happen in partnership with the private sector and civil society, and that's why this conversation is really so important. How do we get there? What is the vision? What's the North Star? And how do we bring these voices together?
Yeah, David, I think what's really useful about your response is highlighting the light and the shadow, the opportunity, but also the things that we need to keep a cautious eye on. But what makes people in the digital space, people in big tech, finance, want to engage with sustainability? Is there a natural touch point where the world of digitization has a natural interlinking or intersection engagement with sustainability?
Yeah, I actually think most of the big tech companies see sustainability as the future and see kind of competitive sustainability as their business edge. So the companies I engage with, the big tech firms, they're all leading in this direction as they think this is the future, and they want to make sure their products and services, have a sustainability lens on them. So there is very much a natural connection point, as you say. I think the challenge is to prevent walled gardens and kind of a fragmentation of this space. We want to ensure that, as a UN system, for example, we can move our data in any of the big clouds, right? We don't want to be captured by a single one. And I think that is still a big challenge, maintaining kind of interoperability and allowing data to move between clouds and between providers is essential. But yeah, the big trends I'm seeing, all the big companies are definitely pushing in this direction. They're doing a huge amount of innovation internally themselves, as well as with their products and services. And I could list a few, but let me just talk about Google, Amazon, and SAP are all leaders in this particular domain.
David, thank you very much. I'm just literally picking up as you're speaking, and of course the point of fragmentation, the risk of fragmentation, and how we need to avoid that. I'm very sure is a point that we might get to double click on a little bit later on in the conversation. Before I move on, though, I do want to talk a little bit about your thoughts on blockchain. As you're talking about a lot of big tech looking at sustainability as their competitive edge, I would imagine that impact reporting becomes an important way of evidencing a lot of the impact that they're having. Blockchain as a way of underpinning impact reporting?
I think I'll hedge a little bit like Luca did. We're looking at it, we're evaluating it. I think the key question is supply chain transparency, right? How do we achieve supply chain transparency from source to market to disposal pathway? And how do we measure the environment and carbon footprint of our products and services across their life cycle? It could be that blockchain is the best way to do that, but that might be overkill. There may be other ways to do that. For example, the European Commission is looking at a digital product passport that would be required for every single product in the European market in order to track it across its life cycle, in order to track its environment and carbon performance. So I think the key question or the key problem to solve is supply chain transparency, and the technology to get there is still being sorted out. I think blockchain could be part of it, but it could also be other technologies like the digital product passport. But let me emphasize one thing, and that comes back to my previous remarks. To avoid fragmentation, right, it's going to require international standards, international data standards, and international standards on doing the measurement, doing the reporting, doing the accounting. They're going to be fundamental, and that's fundamental for quality control, but it's also fundamental for trust. If we can't trust the data, if we can't trust the product, this is all for nothing. So a little pitch there, just how important it's going to be to get the international standards right.
Yeah, it's such an important contribution into this conversation. So as we agitate for a a move from commitments and words into action is to say that the embedding of trust through internationally recognized standards in the monitoring and evaluation is part of how we should action. And so it's not just action for action's sake. I see there's a quick comment from Sarah to you, David. She was asking, well, how can digitalization cut emissions towards being environmentally friendly? And I almost want to say, I saw that question pop up while you were in the middle of the response on the supply chain transparency. And I would say that seems like the direct response to say how we really can move in that direction. Is there anything else you want to add to Sarah? Before I move on, I want to go to Emanuela from here.
Yeah, sure. I think there's some really interesting work that's being done in terms of using apps to help change individual behaviors, right? To try to incentivize people to take on board lower carbon behaviors. And if you want to take a look at the Ant Forest app, this is a fantastic app which tries to incentivize people to adopt low carbon behaviors, low emission behaviors. It rewards them with energy points, and people can then plant real trees with those energy points. And just to give you a sense of the magnitude of the impact, I think around 400 million people have downloaded the app and are currently using it to reduce their emission reduction. So I think, yes, there are supply chain applications, absolutely, but I also think a huge area that we need to look into is this idea of digital nudging and behavioral nudging, and how do we embed lower carbon behaviors directly within these apps to help people choose more sustainably.
Absolutely. So digital nudging, I must say that's the first I've heard of that concept. So really building on that behavioral nudging concept to really nudge some change in behavior is really interesting. Laurie, thank you for your question, because I think it leads me beautifully to Emanuela. I just want to read Laurie's question, Emanuela, and then we'll get into a few questions to you. Laurie is saying the leadership of big tech companies and large banks is heavily male. How would you suggest that women's voices be heard in environmental financing and digitization of financing for the environment? So I want to put that big question just on the side, and I want to come back to it. And maybe to start off here with Emanuela, at a simplified level, what is the role of digital technologies and finance in advancing or enabling women at work?
Thank you, Nosy, and happy to be with you in this conversation. Well, where to start? What is the role of digital technologies and finance? Their role is to be fair and to be inclusive. They need to cater for the needs of also women, for instance. It is very important that digital technologies and finance are conceived, designed, made available and promoted for all, including for women. And on this, perhaps the question that came from the audience, it relates to this, because in order to be conceived and designed also for women, they need to have women in it, and they need to have women representing the needs of other women, so that these services, digital technologies and finance, they are also inclusive. Now, I think it's important to highlight a couple of things, because there is no doubt that these are opportunities. Digital technologies and finance are big opportunities for women in terms also of job opportunities and participation in the labor market. But we also have to be a little bit cautious, because what we are seeing right now is that women are still lagging some of the skills, the STEM skills needed to be part in this business. And some of the reasons behind this is very much related to stereotypes, to masculine culture, etc. The other aspect is that we are seeing how important, for instance, ICTs is for women, in particular also women in the rural areas, women in the most disadvantaged parts of the world. These technologies provide women with an opportunity to be active economically, but they also provide an opportunity to collectively organizing and to have a voice. So as well, you know, the link between voice and technology is extremely important also for those people that are less heard in general. However, if we also look at for instance, labor platforms, digital labor platforms, which were, brought out for the past 10 years, and they were very much promoted as a great opportunity for women. But as a matter of fact, we see that we only have 1 out of 3 platform workers are women. And with COVID, where we thought that a lot of people would have engaged in labor platforms, digital labor platform, in reality, we have not seen many women entering digital labor platform work. And so here the question is, what is the problem? The problem is that we're not putting enough attention on the quality of the work that some of these digital platforms offer. In particular, we have to remember that a lot of these workers are actually without social securities. They are not provided with health insurance, they're not provided with maternity protection, and they're not provided eventually with pensions. And even if we see women engaging in this digital labor platform, because it can provide some flexibility, at the same time, women would still be negotiating time versus skills and versus, for instance, higher tasks, more important tasks, and more paid tasks. And therefore, what we are seeing is that the reproduction of those discrimination and deficits in decent work that exist in the offline work are actually reproduced in the online work. And so here the question is, we need to look more into the quality of the work, not just for women, but of course also for men. And unfortunately, we still need to work a lot on traditional masculine working and societal culture that is very much grounded on the notion of women as the main caregivers and men as the breadwinner. As old-fashioned this sounds, unfortunately, it is still the reality.
Emanuela, thank you so much. You've given us so much in that response. And David, I do actually want to hear a little bit about codes, and I'll come to it in a second. But what I'm hearing you say, Emanuela, is that the action that we're looking for needs to be fair and inclusive. And the only way we meet the metric of it being fair and inclusive is if it is gender responsive. But you're also saying, in response to Laurie, part of being gender responsive means changing the composition of decision makers and making sure that women are in the room with the voice. And I really, for those who are tweeting and lifting sound bites, I think one of the key sound bites that I've just heard is voice and technology, and how technology amplifies voice. And that's so important, especially when we begin to look at peripheral communities and peripheral populations, rural women in particular, and how technology gives them a voice. And then, of course, you've demystified some of the myths about the benefits of digital labor platforms and how they actually work in reality for women, raising the questions of quality of voice, of the lack of social protection, but also some of the replication of the blueprint of what we see in offline work environments replicating itself online. David, let's talk a little bit about codes. As Emmanuel was showing that and raising some of the complexities that we're seeing in terms of the role of digital technologies and maybe even finance when it comes to enabling and advancing women. How is codes helping to solve part of that challenge?
Thanks very much. So let's go back one step in terms of what is CODES. CODES is the Coalition for Digital Environmental Sustainability. It was created about a year ago, and it's part of the Secretary General's Digital Cooperation Roadmap. And what we were trying to do with the CODES initiative is bring stakeholders from all sectors together to kind of agree on this big vision. How does digital transformation and environmental sustainability come together? And we're calling in this action plan for 3 major shifts. We're calling for a shift around how do we enable digital sustainability to come together? What are the enabling frameworks? What are the standards? What kind of education is needed? How do we set that enabling environment up? The second area is all around mitigating the negative impacts, right? How do we deal with the energy, the waste, the inputs, the misinformation, the fake news, all the negative consequences? How do we get a handle on that? And the third area is all around accelerating innovation for sustainability. how can digital tools actually contribute to environmental sustainability. So that's the three-part framework. Now, the framework itself has been co-designed by around 1,000 stakeholders, and it will be launched at Stockholm Plus 50. So that's the big launch event. So I can't say yet that we're having a massive impact because we're still in that visioning stage, but we're trying to put together a long-term vision and a roadmap, and the whole emphasis at Stockholm will be launching 9 major impact initiatives which can take forward those shifts in a very concrete way. So that's codes in a nutshell. What I can say is that we've done absolutely everything we can to make sure it is gender responsive and geographically diverse. And that's been, I think, one of our big challenges. We still have probably too much representation from North America, from Europe. Not enough. There's some, but not enough from some of the other regions in the world. And I think that's where we'd really love to hear further voices and engage in the codes process to ensure it is global and it is representative.
Yeah, David, very, very useful contribution, and of course something for us to keep our eyes on. And as you said, not quite talk about impact yet, but the process, and you speak about 1,000 stakeholders being involved, is certainly one that's promising, even as you talk about some of the gaps in geographical inclusion, and that there is a consciousness and awareness around that. In TDS, let's bring the voice of young people into this conversation. What kind of tools and services in TDS, whether we're talking digital, financial, maybe even social, what kind of tools and services do we need to be putting in the hands of young people if we are going to be able to advance the sustainability agenda?
Okay, thank you, Nod, and for this great opportunity. I'm glad to be part of this conversation, the panel. Speaking of this kind of support that needs to be brought up to the youngsters and the younger generation, I can say like a youth and a communities, we have like a dimension of the support that's being needed. There is financial, but there is support, and I mean there's financial support, there is social, and like I can say like some kind of recognition. So I can categorize the support like we need first like some kind of recognition and meaningful involvement. What I say like recognition and meaningful involvement. Look here, we can say like we are speaking of the reforms, maybe the biodiversity or whatever reforms in the context of Stockholm Plus 50. But there are some maybe surveys that are being conducted to for policy framework. But what do we see is like, of course, youth are being somehow involved in maybe we can say opinion polls and gathering of the views and ideas, but still we don't know if yet their opinions are being brought on board, because in most part of the world, maybe I can be speaking from the African context, like you'll find that the top decision makers are not youth. If you can try to figure out the percentage, you can find maybe if there are youth, maybe less than 30%. So we're not sure like where their views are being brought on board. And the other issue is like the ideological support, because we know that once we are speaking of sustainability, we need to take in consideration the concept of intergenerational equity. We need to be speaking of the current generation, but also featuring featuring the coming generation. And what we can say up here, the connection is on the youth, because the youth, we can say that they're agents of transformation rather than agents of change, because they are experiencing the current condition. They are to some extent being affected by the previous degradation, but still they are there to reveal the same. They can be transforming the same to the generation yet to be born. So once we are speaking some kind of the support, I think apart from those cognition, they need to be like interlinked and integrated to the national, to the global and international arena, international forum and conferences where they can express their interest and raise up their voices. But also apart from the involvement, such kind of, we need like I can call the financial support, because whatever whatever the intervention that's needed to be implemented from the classrooms, from the communities, without financing mechanism, without the financial support, nothing can be done. So still youth, I think they need the financial support to turn their ideas into action. And you can see the themes like we try to move from the from commitment to reaction. But so without financial support, we'll still be doing some kind of monitoring, some kind of reporting, but no, I mean, we will not have been having like solid justification, solid implementation on the ground. So for that stage, I think that financial support is also needed in that matter. Thank you.
Yeah, and TDS, thank you so much. And as you're speaking, I'm watching Luca on my screen, and I'm saying, Luca, young people are asking for more finance, for you guys to review your credit models for some young people funding that needs to come through. But one of the things you speak about in TDS that is so important is what I'm hearing you say, and I stand corrected, but what I'm hearing you saying is we have maybe gotten to the trap of performing the participation and inclusion of young people. So we send out polls and we get young people to participate in the things that are not high stakes. But when it really comes to the decisions that need to be made, young people have no way of knowing to what extent their input and their participation has been actually considered in those decisions. And I think that's a very big and very important conversation. So we can't be youth washing. So what I'm hearing you saying is that from an action perspective, we need to make sure that the action that we see is not youth washing and that there's meaningful participation of young people. It excites me to hear you talking about, David, is that your hand popping up? I'm going to come to you now. It excites me to hear you talking about future generations, even as you are a young person right now, because it certainly means the sustainable thinking and legacy thinking is already in flow. So David, let me give you a quick opportunity, and then I want to make my way back to Luca, not to respond to whether you're giving in TDS money or not, but for more questions to come to you, Luca. David, over to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize and really support what was just said. I think in the policy making process, we've got all these great digital tools, but we still don't know necessarily how to harness them in a policy making process. So yeah, we've got 1,000 people inside codes giving us inputs. Frankly, that's a drop in the bucket. We should have 100,000 people to 1 million people feeding us information, but we still lack the kind of digital tools to do that kind of citizen science or citizen-driven policy-making process. So I think from a policy-making and governance perspective, frankly, we're still kind of stuck a little bit in the analog period. We haven't totally adopted digital tools to get these inputs at scale. We've tried. We're trying different pathways, but it's still messy and it's not exactly clear how to do it. So I still see a big gap in being sort of globally inclusive and then being transparent. How are different stakeholder voices transparently reflected in different documents? That is, policy making is still a little bit like sausage making, right? You don't want to see what goes into it. You don't necessarily want transparency in terms of what goes into a sausage. A little bit like policy making, it's still not as transparent as it needs to be. And I think that is where digital tools and digital governance can certainly help going forward, but we're not there yet.
So David, I'm going to use that maybe as a bridge to come back to Luca, because what I'm hearing you saying is that we're potentially stuck in analog because we're not even asking the right questions or having the right conversations. So that global gap will persist for as long as transparency and inclusion, and we're not asking the right questions to start the right conversations around that. So Luca, on the question of conversations, how do you ensure that your partners, your clients, the people that you collaborate with are themselves having the necessary conversations on sustainability, on ESG, on natural capital risk, etc.? Is there a way, because of course, conversation is the birthplace of action. So to what extent is there an awareness about whether these conversations are top of mind or not?
Yeah, I'll try to pick a few words also that I've heard so far. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. And let me start by saying that is actually also, I think, a very important role for financiers. I mean, of course, banks, financiers, we provide money. That's the basic business model, yeah? But at the same time, we are intermediaries in what happens in the real economy. And actually, the impact and the changes that we want to see don't happen in financiers. They happen in the real economy. They happen with our clients, if you're a bank. They happen with the collaborators, right? They happen there. And David, you used a lot the digital word, but you also used it and linked it to transparency. Again, that's a key word in the financial sector. If just the basic of economics, for financial markets to work well, you need free flow of information and transparency. That works for the money part. It also works for the sustainable part. The more we are able to have transparency, information flow between banks, the financiers, the clients, the more we can allocate capital efficiently according to the targets or commitments that we have set the last decade. So now this decade, we need to move the money accordingly. And the way we do it, Nosy, is exactly like that. You try to have the conversation. Sometimes you can be even a bit provocative and challenge the client. Having frameworks and standards, again, which is something that we discussed, helps to have a common dialogue. And that's what you have to do. As a financier now, it's at least where we operate here, it's basically impossible not to bring these topics up, ESG, if you focus on that as a framework, whenever you want to do a transaction. That will always be part of the conversation. It's basically part of know your client. And in this includes, Emmanuel, I want to bring that in as well, includes the gender lens. There was a question there. Big banks are male heavy. I agree, and we need to fix that. Absolutely. But a lot of the clients we work with are male heavy. And we need to bring that message also towards the clients that we work with. So you see, the dialogue is very important. The frameworks and standards, very important to allow that dialogue. My final comment will be just an observation of the evolution. I think it has improved a lot. If I take the last 5 years, at least at dialogue level, we are definitely having the right conversations. The problem is that conversations are important, but they're still not enough because the title of this seminar is moving from commitments to actions. So, good to have the conversations, but we don't have a lot of time to transform those conversations into the actual actions.
Yeah, look at such an important point, right? The importance of dialogue to help us work through some of the difficult aspects of the conversation. The absence of women is one of them, transparency, the inclusion of young people, but even just to have the conversation on just transitions, because this is where some of the complexities come in, and we have to take on what that transition looks like in the context of that particular economy and in the context of that particular sector. I'm reminded, of course, as you made the comment earlier on about, renewable energy. And we know that there are still some countries that are very dependent on coal industries and what that means for them. But maybe, Emanuela, let me come back to you, because now we're talking about transitions. And I think it's important maybe we just double click on that. What is a gender responsive just transition? Do we have an understanding about what that looks like? And in your view, what is the path to transformative just transition agendas? Your thoughts?
Thank you, Nosy, for this question. So let's start from the definition. Just transition itself, to be just, it has to be gender responsive. It has to be able to take into consideration gender concerns, equality concerns. So it's very important that when we talk about just transition, we really think of also green jobs and green jobs also for women. Now I'd like to just make a couple of points on climate change. That is, of course, linked to just transition eventually, and the fact that climate change impacts women and men differently. There is clear evidence about this, and also the fact that it exacerbates pre-existing gender inequalities, including in the world of work, and in particular for those vulnerable groups, such as, for instance, indigenous women, that are particularly affected by climate change. And we also know that climate change further exacerbates existing care burdens. And I know I stress a lot the issue of care, but in reality, there is a very strong link between care, climate change, just transition, digitalization, and finance. And I was glad to hear Luca before saying that at times also you're supporting hospitals, you're supporting schools, etc. This is all part of the care economy, which is extremely important because the care economy actually generates green jobs. care jobs are green jobs, and in a way, if we want to have a just transition, meaning that it has to be gender responsive, we have to take into account the overall needs, and the overall needs of societies. A large demand actually is to be placed on the care, on unpaid care and paid care work. And so if we look at the importance of, for instance, investing in infrastructures that eventually generate jobs, but they also reduce a time that is spent by women in caring, for instance. The importance of investing in those macroeconomic policies that really have an impact on women's jobs, including green jobs. The importance of investing in industrial and sectoral policies, and the care sector is one of these sectors that are particularly important. Enterprise policies, skill development policies, occupational health and safety policies, and of course, social protection. I mean, I think it's very important to make all these linkages. And going back to the care sector, which is a sector that is overlooked, also the link with just transition and climate change, it's still overlooked, but it is very important because it can generate more than 300 million jobs. If we look at all the infrastructures, the care infrastructures, services and policies that are needed, because we have a massive deficit of such care policies and care infrastructures. And investments, yes, this would have a high cost because the ILO estimates that it would actually cost, sorry, I need to find the number. It would actually cost $5.4 trillion by 2030 if we want to close the care gaps that exist in policies and in care services. But this, of course, would also generate tax revenues from increased earnings, and employment would rise as well, reducing the funding requirement to a net of 3.2% of GDP, so of the global GDP. So to say that, I think it's very important to look at this topic in a comprehensive manner, as it was mentioned at the very beginning by Dr. Assad, and looking at all these linkages that can be very transformative and therefore support just transition.
So Emanuela, again, I want to lift some keywords that you've said here. The action that we're looking for is comprehensive. And it is also, and I think you've given us a bit of schooling on the importance of the care economy, because as you've said, in many of the conversations when we're talking about a just transition, there hasn't really been a big focus on the care economy and the opportunity to leverage different policies to bring in the necessary investments into their care economy, which is really interesting to hear from you. And that number, of course, is absolutely staggering at $5.4 trillion US dollars. I want to bring in a bit more of the audience voice once again on the back of that. Two comments. The first one, comment from Honam Azanda, and it's a comment and Tedious that I want you to think about. Honam is saying, how can youths with very little experience lead roles in undertaking sustainability projects and winning grants? So Honam is saying, I get that we want young people, and Tedious, we want young people around the table, we want people in the room, but with little experience, how can you play a lead role in sustainability projects, and how can you ensure that those that are seeking to do the work can actually win those projects? Look at in another way, the question that's not been asked, but that is being asked by Honam is, are young people a liability in the project proposals, or are they a value add? So when you're having these conversations around the standards, are you looking at your clients and saying, To what extent do you have young people included? Does that make you more, does that qualify you more for the loan, or does that detract away from you because it's tedious at the age of 20 odd something is part of your project team? I'm going to leave that to you two gentlemen. I'm going to come back to it. I do want to pick up on the question from Brittany for yourself, David and Emanuela. Brittany is saying there is a general lack of trust in government, especially from communities historically on the losing end of government policies, given a history of big promises with very little actual action. What changes need to be made to rebuild that trust and the redistributive power more equitably? And I think it's a really brilliant question. Emmanuel, let me give you a go at it first, because I see you nodding more vigorously than David on that one. And then David, let's go for your comments on that. And then I want to come to Luca and NTDS about the inclusion of young people in project teams. To Emanuela first.
I think it's a great question, and it also comes at a time where we are seeing a restriction of rights and democratic space for civil society and the different groups to actually be open and to be listened to. There is therefore a need to strengthen even more these networks, these associations, all the civil society that has an opportunity to really come up with the real issue, to represent people, to represent voices. In the world of work, for instance, it is particularly important to have trade unions and employers' organizations to keep governments accountable of the legislation that they pass on relating to labor rights, and also to ensure that a lot of these issues that we are discussing today, and that eventually boils down to the world of work, because all this digital world, financing world, as also Luca mentioned, I mean, at the end of the day, it is people implementing projects, it is people working, and it is very important that they are represented. And if we look at, for instance, interesting examples of collective agreements, for instance, collective bargaining agreements that look at the impact of climate change, for instance, or collective agreements that take into consideration this very fast changing world of work that is characterized also by the environmental degradation. It's very important to make sure that these agreements actually bring the voices and of everyone, and especially that hold on the rights of people, because there is a regression in terms of rights in many countries, and also globally there is less openness and availability to discuss such issues. So I think it's a great question.
And on the back of a great question, a great response, David, I'd love to bring your voice in here. You know, the phrase I jotted down on my notes here is broken promise fatigue, and the extent to which it deters action. You know, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I suffer from broken promise fatigue as much as anybody at the international level. I think the question of digitalizing trust is probably the subject of about 1,000 PhDs. I think it's a fascinating topic. I think when it comes to policy making, digital tools can sort of help build that trust, I think, in three ways. I think on the one hand, there's a question of how are policies made, right? How do you do inclusive policy making? And I think digital tools can provide more channels for more inputs from populations to assist in that policy making process. But I think then once the policies are set, this is where the whole idea of monitoring and transparency comes in, right? There has to be key performance indicators, there has to be data collection, and there has to be transparent reporting around them, where the performance of the government is, you know, disclosed, and where people can judge, you know, what the performance has been like. So I think that's the second domain. And I think the third domain is increasingly in the area of dispute resolution, right? when there has been some kind of infraction, when there has been some kind of violation of rights. Digital channels for dispute resolution are increasingly being used, especially in the mining sector, for example. So I think there are three pathways to build trust, but ultimately trust making is very much kind of the most human process there is, right? And I think we need to really understand how it interfaces with digital transformation and what are those different pathways for building trust. And I think we have to also just recognize that trust building can simply be a slow process, right? Maybe it is simply an analog process in many cases. And this is what I'm finding, especially in the codes process. A lot of it does come down to human relationships, right? And it's a long-term process that you can't necessarily accelerate always with digital tools.
So I'm going to be a little bit cheeky here in the way that I respond. Take David's question and link it to Luca and Ntedious. So Luca, do you trust a proposal more because it is inclusive of young people than a proposal that is not? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh boy, no. Let me try and be honest here and say what is the practice versus what I think it should be. Okay. I mean, I think in the financial sector, of course, because it is about risk and risk taking, that's what it's about. Unfortunately, I would say that still the practice is very much around track record, right? Track record is a big element of understanding and evaluating risk. Still, that's the practice, huh? And so when you look at it that way, the youth element, given the lower track record, is usually perceived, and I'm using this word very carefully, is usually perceived potentially as bringing down the contribution rather than increasing it. But now let me put a bit of context about what I think instead we should be doing, and we do a little bit here, right? Is that makes sense when you look ahead at a decade that you think is going to be stable, and you want tomorrow to be the same as yesterday. But the truth is that we all agree, I believe, around this panel and in the audience, that actually we need to turn the world upside down if we want to meet some of these targets, right, and commitments that we've done. So suddenly the context is completely different. Suddenly track record and being stuck in the old ways of thinking is more of a negative, if you think about it, than a positive. So as a minimum, we should have a balance. As a minimum, we should have a balance. So we should have, as Ntedious mentioned, we should have really young voice represented, also all the way to leadership levels, or to decision-making levels, because they have three characteristics. They are able to embrace change much better. That's just a fact. I think everybody over a certain age can agree on that, including myself. And that includes digitalization, their ability to see and take value out of digitalization is way superior than when you're stuck into your ways of thinking. Two, they're able to challenge, and usually that's down to characters as well, but on average they're able to challenge the status quo, and that's something that we need. It's a skill and a characteristic that we need. And the third one, which is not to be underestimated, however much we care, the young must be caring more, because it comes down to the motivation and to the fact that they are going to be around when some of these problems will come, and some other of us will not be around. So, this makes it very logical to say that, of course, having a balanced team, let's say, in our client is a positive today, much more than it used to be. I leave it there.
Luca, thank you. Ntedious, let me bring your voice in. David, I noticed your hand. Ntedious, I think you were typing a response. I think your voice is going to be even better. Share your thoughts on this question.
Yeah, okay. Just responding to the question that has been posed by Holnam. I think it's somebody from Ghana. Yeah. Okay, so for me, from my perspective is, there is like okay, I'll make it as follows. Like, if you can go through what I wrote in the chat, like, there's two. I can say two sides of the same coin. There's the problem that need to be resolved by the you can say the funders or the supporting organization or the donors, but the other problem still on the youth themselves or ourselves, because starting from our side, like we need to we first need to brand ourselves. We need to bring our knowledge base, our technical expertise, so that someone can know that you are able to do something. On the other side, you can find that there's a large pool of youth that are able. They're able to do something. They're able to implement some intervention that are more sustainable, and that can be they can deliver. They can bring a great shift, but they are not trusted. If you see, for instance, you can see in some of the countries, if there is advertisement of their work position, you see still at the same time, the people will be saying that we need you to be involved, we need hotel you to be involved, the young generation to be empowered. But the experience, if you see among the criteria, they're putting experience more than 5, more than 10. While at the same time, youth they are just coming from school, and sometimes they don't have such solid experience, but they have been engaged in several ways. So what I can say, we need for first as youth, we need to blend ourselves, and one of the best way we can blend ourselves, to be involved in this, I can say, the international blog forum, and various platforms, because there is where you can meet potential people. For instance, we are meeting Mr. Luke, we are meeting David, we are meeting Emmanuel, meeting Shabalala. So I think this is one of the most significant part. But once it comes to the side of the funders and the donors or supporters, I think they need to consider to put a specific consideration to the initiative that are youth-led or youth-driven or youth-based, because as I said in my first intervention, youth are, we can say that youth are the transformation. The agents for transformation. They are there for the present. They have experienced what has happened the last time, but still they are there to reveal the same and to transform the knowledge and the practice and intervention to the generation yet to be born. So I can say that we should complement to each other.
And Luca, I think you're exactly on the same page. I think listening to the both of you, the consistent messaging is what got us here won't get us there. And so it is the idea that business as usual is just not going to suffice. Leaning only on track record is not going to be enough. And we need transformative change, your words and TDS. And that transformative change requires a change in mindset in how we include young people and how we leverage their energy as well. David, you had your hand up. A quick comment from you, Luca, to you, and then I want to make my way back to Emanuela.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on that in the companies I'm seeing in the digital tech space, the youth, younger people, let's say, make up a huge amount of the coders, and sort of they're kind of the back end of the digital transformation economy, And I think those people who are in coding roles really have a lot of agency to start influencing from the bottom up the trajectory of these companies. I think what they sometimes lack is a vision on what they can do individually inside these companies. These are big behemoths, right? What can a single person do? What I can tell you is I've seen a lot of younger people take on initiatives inside of companies and actually drive change from within. And so I would say that organizing within companies and trying to come up with pathways for impact inside is also a very valuable thing to do. The other thing that I see a lot of is innovation ecosystems in many developing countries are sprouting up in big capitals, and a lot of those are driven by younger members of the population. So getting involved in innovation ecosystems and networking with some of the other parts of society is another way to get involved and to really get some experience in how to use these tools.
Yeah, I think it's really useful to also hear the pathways to action, right? And that's really, really encouraging in this conversation as we're listening into you, David, about the various initiatives that you've just seen. And I'm sure you're just literally sharing the tip of the iceberg of what is actually happening out there and what's available. Luca, your hand popped up while Antidius was speaking.
Yeah, maybe just very quickly. I know we're coming to the end, but I wanted to make an important point, I think, from a finance world perspective. Because you mentioned this idea, and we discussed it, Antidius, now from the young, right? But we have a decade of transformation. We can't rely so much on track record, right? We need to look more forward than behind, right? that you have to understand, for the financiers, that is uncomfortable. That is uncomfortable, yeah, because we look at risks and we evaluate projects. At the end of the day, they need to be bankable, you know, and blah 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 blah. So that is uncomfortable, and that's where policy becomes even more important. So policy's role is to keep the financial players comfortable with this change that we have to finance, and so policy needs to create that ecosystem, and stability of policies is extremely important in this to provide that extra comfort. I just want to make this point. It's not as directly linked to youth, but it's important in this dialogue.
It's a critical point, and thank you for taking the time to raise that, because we do have to find a way of overcoming the barrier. And if we're saying there's barriers to finance for young people and women and other peripheral communities, it is what I'm hearing you say, improvement in policy that allows us to bring down some of those risks. Emanuela, there's a question from Laurie, and my screen's just jumped, so I'm going to just find it again. And I thought it was a great question that I want to come to. It says that the question is, the majority of women in the world and a great many men are actually employed in the informal sector. Many of these jobs are in the green economy, for example, waste collection. And again, my screen is jumped, but the end of the question from Laurie is to say, how can we link formal financing for the environment to the informal sector? I'd love your thoughts on that first, Emanuela.
And I think the informal sector, the informal economy, has, as the participant mentioned, is a huge sector that employs a lot of men primarily, but more women in certain continents. And informal economy, most of the times, is very much linked also to poor working conditions and to deficits in decent work. People in the informal work tend to have precarious contracts, tend not to be covered by any sort of social security. In particular for women, you know, they would be left behind in case of pregnancy. They would be left behind in case of health issues related to their reproductive role. And women would also be more exposed to violence and harassment while they are working. And as you rightly said, a lot of women and men are involved in the informal economy in economic activities that are related to green jobs, that are related to just transition. And certainly we need to try to support these great initiatives to become more formal, so that these people would, these workers would also be entitled to decent work. And we have seen great examples of such opportunities, for instance, through cooperatives. There are a lot of women-only cooperatives and cooperatives made by women and men that work in the context of environment. And such cooperatives, some of them have become also very large, and they have been able to tap into financial resources to scale up their businesses. Cooperatives are a very interesting model that allows for a democratic sharing of decision-making power. It's very interesting for women as a model, because it's a model that also allows sometimes for more flexibility that provides more opportunities to manage the time and balance better work and family responsibilities. So great opportunities in those areas, but it's also not easy to transit from the informal to the formal sector, and that's where we need investments.
And of course, we know that the informal sector, Manuela, is much larger and more predominant in developing countries. I'm thinking about the African continent myself. And David, it leads me to this question about what about the digital divide? Have we overcome that? You know, are we at a stage where we can talk about, you know, leveraging digital technologies where some of us believe that there are probably still big swathes of the population that don't have last mile connectivity, that are not part of this digital world that we're talking about. You know, how do we accelerate that in the decade of action, so we can really see some of the things that we're talking about really accessible to a real global population and not aspects of the global population?
Fantastic question. I can answer parts of it. And you know, at the moment, as far as I recall the numbers, about half the planet is connected, half the planet is still disconnected, right? Something in that magnitude. Maybe it's 55% now, but it's certainly you know, in that order of magnitude. So it's a huge problem, and you know, it's getting better, but it's still a massive challenge to overcome. As you say, the basic infrastructure, getting the infrastructure into some of the disconnected areas is a huge cost. That we still don't have necessarily the kind of financial commitments to overcome that cost. So yeah, it's a big challenge, and it's going to require these major public-private partnerships to wire the earth. But this is exactly that. This goes back to the shadow question, right? If only half of the world is connected and the digital footprint is already very large, what's going to happen when the entire world is connected? How much energy is going to be consumed? How many rare earth minerals are going to be consumed? How much e-waste is going to be consumed? We need to be thinking about, you know, mitigating those negative sides as we connect the rest of the planet. And that's exactly the challenge we face. And I think this is exactly why it's so important to establish like public procurement guidelines around digital infrastructure, right? Digital infrastructure has to be green by default. And we need to get some global commitments around the kind of digital infrastructure that we're installing now to bridge that digital divide.
Thanks for that, David. I want to test some of that with Antidius, because Antidius, I would imagine that young people that are locked out of the digital world because of a lack of digital infrastructure or lack of digital tools and access essentially can get locked out of many opportunities to be part of the action that needs to come about. Question to you very quickly: what are the tools and services that you think young people like you need in order to really be empowered to be a part of the implementation and the monitoring of the Stockholm Plus 50 commitments?
Okay, thank you for a good question. But I think some of these points I made it before, but I'll go and then again. As I first pointed out some kind of financial support, but some kind of integration and involvement. And saying of the involvement, we are now like in transformation to the digital world, and as we say, like every part has a negative and positive side of the coin. Yeah. Frankly speaking, once we are, I think I can say like we are going through the COVID-19 era, we have some lessons to learn, because I think now by that time, most part of the population is like now connected to the digital world, because you can see like now some people have the access to internet-based the visual platform of engagement. Some people like before the COVID-19, maybe the knowledge and the awareness about the Zoom platform, the webinars, the online platform was a little bit low. But after due to the COVID the COVID incidents that the physical meetings and physical intervention, like I can say like now at least a large part of the population and a large part of youth in that matter are now like aware and connected to the visual, to the internet-based working platform where they can be involved from regardless from the past to the year. So I think that for that part is like a little bit we are some steps ahead. So what is the like left like the financial support and the cognition like to be involved in different platforms. Yeah, and that so I can say like I will like looking on the current theme, like we are trying to turn from the commitment to from commitment to action. I think the principle like we need to, there is 3P principle, like a 3P principle, but we need to invest on 3P, to address 3P and to achieve 3P. What I mean we need to invest more on private public partnership, so as to say to solve the population, the popular population problems, to attain people, planet, prosperity, and this cannot be attained without commitment and the meaningful involvement of youth and local communities from the ground.
Yeah, and Tedious, thank you very much. So public-private partnerships for people, planet, and prosperity. I think it's a really good way of pulling in the collaborative nature that's required to pull off the kind of action that we're calling for at this particular time as we prepare, of course, not only for Stockholm Plus 50, but the world beyond that. And that really is the invitation and the call to action. Now, to close off this conversation, I'm going to try and close it off in a fun way. I feel that you guys have had too much fun. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit as a way of closing off the conversation. I want you all to think about if you could reduce this conversation to an instruction about the kind of action that we're looking for. And this instruction is going to be on a billboard in the busiest city where you are. It is a billboard. So Luca, I can see you thinking deeply. It's not an executive summary. It's not a paragraph. It's a billboard. So no more than 10 words. And the billboard starts off with the action we want. The action we want, and you get to complete the sentence based on what you think the most important type of action is that we're looking for. The action we want. Now, and Tedious, I'm going to let you go last because I think as the youngest person in the group, you're probably the most creative and you're really going to knock it out the ballpark. So I'm going to start off with Luca. The action we want, Luca, how would you complete that sentence?
Stop whining, move the money.
I absolutely love that. The action we want, stop whining, move the money. Okay, that's fantastic. Emanuela?
I would say have more women leading the way.
The action we want is with more women leading the way. David, where do you take us?
The action we want is to become a green consumer using digital apps.
To become a green consumer using digital apps. For those following on social media, I certainly hope that you are tweeting many of these brilliant sound bites. And Tedious, you get to take us home. The action we want.
I think I can say the action we want is like go green, act now, include everyone, and live sustainable.
Go green, include everyone, act now, and live sustainably. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's Luca De Lorenzo, ladies and gentlemen, David Jensen, it's Emanuela Posen, and it's Antedious Raphael leading into the conversation about how might we translate commitments and words into actual action, and some brilliant sound bites coming out of that conversation. And that concludes the panel discussion, which I believe has been absolutely robust, the third webinar of the GGKP 4-part series. Now, as I wrap it up, a quick reminder, Stockholm Plus 50.global as one of the as the website to go and visit. As we heard from John earlier, greenforum.org, go and register so that you can be part of the community and really interact and engage and make sure that your voice is heard. And as always, please don't forget the survey that is going to be making its way to you so that we get the opportunity to keep improving this experience and making sure that we're creating meaningful pathways to include your voice in the conversation. A big thank you to Asad as well, who kicked us off by setting the scene. Thank you so much for joining us. From myself at the tip of the African continent in Johannesburg, it is goodbye for now.